Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Curt DiCamillo, the Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. I'd also like to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website that you can watch at any time. Famous the world over as a celebrated Baroque palace and sublime landscape, as well as celebrated for its on-screen alter ego as Brideshead, Castle Howard has also been home to the Howard family for more than 3 centuries. Today, Castle Howard's curator, Christopher Ridgway, will take us on a tour of some of the principal characters and events in the rise, fall, and rebirth of this great Yorkshire estate over the past 9 generations. This webinar was made possible by the support of an anonymous donor, for which we're very grateful. Christopher Ridgway has been the curator at Castle Howard since 1985. He's lectured on the house, its history, and collections around the world, and published extensively on the subject. Chris is also chair of the Yorkshire Country House Partnership, a collaborative research project among the houses of the region, and is adjunct professor at the Center for the Study of Historic Irish Houses and Estates at Maynooth University, part of the National University of Ireland. He also sits on the board of the Irish Heritage Trust, and in 2019 was awarded a UK Lifetime Achievement Award. His recent publications include 2011's Castle Howard and Brideshead, Fact, Fiction, and In Between, and New Walls for Old Pictures, Country House Collections, Their Past, Present, and Future, which was published in 2021. Please join me in welcoming the great Christopher Ridgway.
Thank you very much, and hello to everybody from a fine weathered Yorkshire, although nightfall is dropping now, so not midday as it is with you. Well, where am I going to begin? I mean, how am I going to tell the story of Castle Howard in less than an hour? Ideally, I would need much longer, maybe as much as 300 years. There are so many stories to tell, so many characters to introduce, so many sights to see. It's like trying to squeeze a gallon into a pint-sized bottle. And over the years, I've talked to you about various aspects of Castle Howard: its architecture, collections, gardens, the women of the family, the fire, and Christmas in the house. But today I'm going to offer a brisk canter through more than 300 years of the family. And the aim really is to present a house and a family who have jointly endured for more than 3 centuries, and who, I very much hope, will endure for another 300 years. So at the end of my talk, I'm going to ask you all to reach for your forward planners so we can fix a date for the next installment of this saga, perhaps something like November 23, 24. But in the meantime, here's the home of the Howard family at Castle Howard in Yorkshire. 9 generations have lived in this Baroque mansion since it was built at the beginning of the 18th century for Charles Howard, 3rd Earl of Carlisle, by 2 of England's most celebrated architects, Sir John Vanbrugh and Nicholas Hawksmoor. Now, the Howard family is divided between many branches throughout England, occupying many different houses. They're all related in some way because ultimately they can trace their ancestry back to the late 15th, early 16th century with the first Dukes of Norfolk. John Howard, created first Duke by Richard III in 1483, and possibly implicated in the infamous murder of the young princes in the Tower of London. Thomas, the second Duke, who led the victorious English army in the defeat of the Scots at Flodden Field in 1513. And then his son, Thomas, the third Duke on the right of the screen, born in 1473, who served King Henry VIII as a minister and a military commander. In 1536, Norfolk journeyed north into England to suppress the Pilgrimage of Grace, the risings in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire sparked by the dissolution of the monasteries. Initially, Norfolk played a conciliatory role, diffusing the revolt, but when trouble flared up once more, he embarked on a punitive expedition throughout the north, laying waste to religious houses and hanging nearly 200 rebels. But Norfolk is most famous as the man who supplied the king with two of his wives, his nieces Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Now, wives number 2 and number 5 may have met a grisly end at the executioner's block, but the Duke himself survived the ruthless world of Tudor court politics, albeit not before he had endured a near brush with the executioner's axe. During the dying days of Henry VIII's reign, as families jockeyed for influence with the young Prince Edward who would succeed to the throne, the Howards found themselves outmaneuvered by the Seymour family. Late in 1546, the third Duke and his son Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, were both imprisoned in the Tower of London and charged with treason. In January 1547, Surrey was beheaded, and his father was due to meet the same fate a few days later. But on the night of the 27th of January, King Henry died, and so the Duke survived by the narrowest of margins, and went on to die peacefully years later. But not so other members of his extended family. In addition to his son, the Earl of Surrey, and his two nieces, more than 20 Howards and their kinsmen were imprisoned, executed, or killed in battle throughout the turbulent 16th and 17th centuries. And these included the fourth Duke of Norfolk, executed in 1572 by Queen Elizabeth for conspiring with Mary, Queen of Scots. But it says something about how robust this dynasty was to have withstood such a rate of attrition during these 2 centuries. And moreover, the Howard family survived long after the Tudor dynasty itself had passed with the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1603. But as with all families, as time went by, it divided and subdivided into multiple branches or cadet lines. And Castle Howard, the line here begins with the third Duke's great-grandson, Lord William Howard of Naworth Castle in Cumbria. Now, of course, at this time, Castle Howard had not been dreamt of, let alone built, but importantly, Lord William's extensive landholdings in the north of England included an estate in Yorkshire that would in time become the base for his descendants. And in the middle of the 17th century, his great-grandson Charles Howard skillfully negotiated the conflicting loyalties of the English Civil War, managing to serve the Republic under Oliver Cromwell, but also to emerge unscathed at the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 and to be created first Earl of Carlisle by Charles II in 1661. And in 1663, he was dispatched to Russia as an ambassador on an ill-fated diplomatic expedition. He set sail for the northern port of Archangel, from where he journeyed to Moscow by river and overland. And the onset of the winter made travelling grievous and insupportable, as it was reported, and soon the English were dressed in thick furs and regularly imbibing what they referred to as strong water to keep themselves warm. This was undoubtedly vodka. And at his first audience, Carlisle presented Tsar Alexei with ambassadorial gifts of gold, silver, textiles, clocks, and firearms. And these were carried into the Kremlin by a procession of 130 men. And the English themselves were dazzled by the splendour of the Russian court, especially the bright jewels worn by courtiers. But unfortunately, the negotiations were dogged by squabbles and misunderstandings and achieved very little. Further slights, real or imagined, were recorded by both parties. At the grand feast, the English took offence at how Carlisle was seated at a distance from the Tsar and given no table napkins. But this was a misreading of Russian customs. The Tsar would always sit alone and eat, but when he sent food and drink to Carlisle's table, this was, in Russian eyes, a mark of esteem and not a condescending gesture. The feast, which comprised 500 dishes and lasted 9 hours, also contained some amusing episodes, as when the Tsar and Carlisle exchanged repeated toasts, and Carlisle grew suspicious at Alexei's capacity to imbibe so much and remain upright. And he even wondered if he was being subjected to the old trick of his host drinking cups that had been watered down. However, at the end of the evening, Alexei fell over and retired with a nosebleed. The group eventually left Moscow in September and journeyed overland via Stockholm and Copenhagen back to England. And on arriving in London, the Earl found an official complaint lodged against him. The mission had been a diplomatic disaster. Well, these early episodes give a flavour to the colourful ancestry of the Howards of Castle Howard. And in addition to political and military missions, generations of the family went on the Grand Tour, that essential rite of passage for young aristocrats who were keen to learn about the culture and history of Europe, and most especially Italy, ancient and modern. Between 1688 and 1691, Charles Howard, later to become 3rd Earl, and the man who would be responsible for the building of Castle Howard at the end of the century, journeyed through Holland and Germany to Vienna before crossing the Alps to reach Venice and Padua. And in the course of this journey, he compiled a commonplace book with comments on eminent artists such as Carlo Maratti on the top left of the picture there. There were quotations from ancient authors and notes on how regions and towns were gathered, and with an eye to his social agenda, he also listed the important noble families in Venice, Rome, and Naples. But by the late 1690s, as Carlisle integrated himself into political circles at the court of King William III, he also decided to consolidate his position as a landowning grandee and improve his estates in Yorkshire. He desperately wanted a house that befitted his status. So he decided to build a magnificent new mansion at the ancient family seat of Henderskelf Castle. Now, the village of Henderskelf was a sleepy settlement consisting of an old castle, a church, and a few dozen dwellings, all of which were swept away with the building of Castle Howard. And of course, Castle Howard was and is a stupendous architectural achievement, praised by contemporaries for its scale and grandeur, and fittingly, it featured in the background of his portrait, painted in 1728 by William Aikman. It was distinguished by the gigantic dome and sumptuously decorated indoors with frescoes by Antonio Pellegrini in the great hall below. And outdoors, an entire landscape was fashioned in a sublime manner. Now, the Earl's marriage in 1683 to Anne Capel, daughter of the Earl of Essex, produced 5 children. Henry, the future 4th Earl, a second son, and between 1695 and 1701, Anne gave birth to 3 daughters, Mary, Anne, and Elizabeth. But by the early 1700s, the marriage had begun to fail. Really, from 1699 onwards, her husband had become enamoured by something else, his grand project, the creation of Castle Howard. And by 1704, husband and wife were on the verge of separating. Anne left Yorkshire, and Carlisle more or less abandoned London. But the 3rd Earl formed close attachments to his children, especially with his 3 daughters, who are depicted in the sparkling portrait by Antonio Pellegrini of around 1711. And the picture makes no attempt to identify the sisters. They look remarkably alike and appear a similar age. Even their hairstyles are identical. And it's clear that the picture was commissioned to proclaim the girls' cultured elegance, their wealth, and their equal suitability as potential wives. And after leaving home from roughly the 1720s onwards, each of the girls wrote to their father regularly, and nearly 250 of their letters survive. And this correspondence provides a rich insight into their lives. We know much about their personalities, even if we can't identify each girl from the triple portrait. Mary, and take your pick whichever she is in this picture, the eldest daughter, she remained a spinster all her life and was also a professional invalid who spent her life taking the waters at spa towns such as Scarborough, Tunbridge Wells and Bath, where she once had the misfortune to be chased through the streets by a runaway bull. And Anne, the middle daughter, married Francis Ingram of Temple Newsam in 1718, thereby signalling the first of the great marriage alliances between the Howards and the Ingrams in this case, another aristocratic family. Her first marriage was short-lived. Her husband died in 1721, leaving behind mountainous debts incurred from his disastrous South Sea speculations. And Anne had to settle her husband's affairs and pay off his debts, which involved a lengthy legal dispute. And she detested lawyers, calling them terrible creatures, incapable of talking plainly. But she enjoyed her independence as a widow, or being mistress of myself, as she termed it, and in the summer of 1730 she made a tour of Holland, travelling by herself. Her outward bound voyage was typical of the time. She set sail from Hull to Antwerp, but after 2 days, due to lack of wind, she'd only reached Yarmouth, barely 200 miles away on the English coast. So she disembarked briefly to enjoy a fish supper of mackerel, sole and cauliflower. And then, arriving eventually at Antwerp, she was warned how customs officials confiscated foreign currency. So she hid her money in her shoes, nearly crippling herself. And she toured through Amsterdam, Utrecht and The Hague, visiting houses, churches, gardens and galleries. This was in effect her grand tour. And when she reached Paris, she was astonished by the magnificence of Versailles. And after numerous invitations to dinner, she concluded that France was a very fine country for an epicure. Now the girls maintained good relations with their brother, whose life was devoted to connoisseurship and assembling the magnificent art collections. And such was his reputation that the author Horace Walpole described him as a great virtuoso. And a huge and important phase of collecting began when the young Henry Howard, future 4th Earl, first visited Italy in 1714-15, kindling his enthusiasm for Roman antiquities. And he returned steeped in the art and architecture of Italy. And in the early 1720s, he put this knowledge to practical effect when discussing with his father and Nicholas Hawksmoor the designs for temples in the gardens at Castle Howard. And on the top, Palladio's famous Villa Rotunda clearly influenced the design of Vanbrugh's temple. And at the bottom, Bramante's Tempietto in Rome is clearly echoed in the shape of Hawksmoor's mausoleum. And during this period, there's a sense that Carlisle, his son, and his architects were not so much copying ancient buildings as trying to recreate ancient Rome in the Yorkshire landscape. But in 1738-39, just after he had inherited the title on the death of his father, the 4th Earl returned to Italy, and from this visit can be dated a huge influx of art, which really determined the character of Castle Howard for the next century. His greatest contribution lay in assembling the collection of antique sculpture, and these treasures arrived in England in the 1740s, and today they are mostly housed along the Antique Passage. The Earl was also a devotee of Italian painting, and he augmented the flavour of ancient Rome by commissioning a set of 6 stunning capriccio views of Roman ruins from the artist Paolo Panini. These were composite fantasy views of real buildings in imaginary settings, depicting items that every self-respecting connoisseur would have visited and studied: the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Arch of Titus, and so on. And in a sense, they are the equivalent of a multi-view postcard we might buy today. And before the era of photography, the only way one could take away views of Roman ruins and famous sites was either to employ a professional draftsman to accompany one on a tour, and many travellers did, or to commission images such as these from local artists. And the fourth Earl's pleasure in Venice manifested itself in his purchase of nearly 40 to 50 view pictures of the city. Some were by the great master Canaletto himself, others by Bernardo Bellotto, Canaletto's nephew, and some by their younger contemporary, Michele Marieschi. Well, today only 3 paintings from this Venetian collection remain in the house. A handful were sold at the end of the 19th century and in the 1920s. More were destroyed in the disastrous fire of 1940, and the rump auctioned afterwards in 1944. But most of the dispersed pictures can be traced to their new homes in galleries or private collections around the world today. And one large panoramic view of the Bacino is today just down the road from yourselves at the MFA in Boston. And these are a reminder that art collections have a long history of being assembled, broken up, and acquired by new owners. And indeed, some paintings have travelled more times than their owners ever have. But the fourth Earl's family life was not without tragedy. For his first wife died in 1742, and within the space of 5 years he lost 3 sons and a daughter. With no male heir, the family line was therefore in danger of dying out. His second wife, nearly half his age, was Isabella, daughter of Lord Byron of Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire. Their marriage was a success, lasting 15 years, during which time Isabella gave birth to 4 daughters and, crucially, 1 son, Frederick, the future 5th Earl. And all of this generation lived to old age. Isabella was an energetic chatelaine at Castle Howard, redecorating rooms in a new Chinese style, supervising domestic expenditure. Household accounts, for example, show a meticulous grasp of detail. And she began compiling a book of receipts. This contained more than 200 recipes, medicinal remedies, and household tips. At this time in the 1750s, the kitchen gardens were enlarged to accommodate extra stove houses and a conservatory for growing exotic fruit. And so it's no surprise to find that Isabella included 2 recipes for pineapples, one for preserving them and one for making pineapple chips, i.e. sugar-coated delicacies. And for a host to present a homegrown pineapple at table, especially in the north of England, I know this is no big deal in Florida, but in Yorkshire, this was a mark of wealth and status. The pineapple was arguably more prestigious than the expensive porcelain, in this case, a Crown Derby dessert service. But Isabella's life at Castle Howard came to a close when she was widowed in 1758. Within a year, she remarried, but this match was not a success, and by the end of the 1760s, having separated from her husband, she left England, embarking on a wandering existence in Europe. At first settling in the south of France near Vaucluse, and then on the shores of Lake Geneva. Isabella enjoyed both the climate and the local society, and among her French neighbours was the family of the notorious Marquis de Sade. And while in Switzerland, she's reputed to have met the great French writer Voltaire. Well, her son may have been scandalised by his mother's behaviour, but he too enjoyed the cultural attractions of the Grand Tour and followed in the footsteps of his father and his grandfather. In 1767, he travelled through France, down to Nice and then to Turin before venturing further south. His letters talk of his anxiety at crossing the Alps in winter. He feared the cold weather and the treacherous mountain passes. They're a mixture of gossip, reports on his health, and regular accounts of his faithful travelling companion, his dog Rover, as depicted here in Sir Joshua Reynolds's famous portrait, seen at the bottom right corner of the picture. Now, Rover's adventures in Europe included getting lost in France, peering over the precipices in the Alps whilst his master was cowering with vertigo, chasing carriages, being attacked by other dogs, even breaking a leg in Florence, and for a while the Earl left Rover with his leg set in the care of the Queen of Naples. And at one point he even jokingly talked about commissioning the great artist Pompeo Battoni to paint Rover's portrait. Now, the Earl may have returned to England at the end of 1769 with carriage loads of art treasures, but alas, one thing he did not return with was Rover, who met his end in Paris, crossing one boulevard too many to be run over by a passing coach. Later, in 1778, the fifth Earl was dispatched to North America, appointed as chief of the commissioners sent to talk with the colonists. And he prepared a memorandum of the most important political figures in each state, from New Hampshire all the way down to Georgia. And heading the Massachusetts list were, unsurprisingly, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. But it's not clear if the fifth Earl met any of the people listed. The mission was a diplomatic failure, the Americans refusing to mediate. Congress had hardened its attitude toward Britain after signing a treaty with France, who had sent a fleet to America. And Carlyle despaired how the common people hate us in their hearts, and he could see little reason for the commission to remain any longer. And he also quarrelled with the French commander, the Marquis de Lafayette, who challenged him to a duel, which Carlyle declined with honour. And by November, the British set sail for home. But less known is how during the mission he penned a series of heartfelt letters to his wife Caroline. Like many travellers away from home, he was missing his loved ones. He suggested she acquire a map and then plot in his progress as she received his letters. And he also hungered for news, especially of his children, urging Caroline to turn her letters to him into little books. He reported terrific storms during the voyage, and also the quaint sight of a Guernsey cow kept on board the ship in order to ensure fresh supplies of milk. In America, he was plagued by gnats that were, he claimed, as big as sparrows. He took to wearing trousers for protection, and this was an unfamiliar article of clothing. And he amused himself by buying a pet raccoon. With temperatures in the mid-90s, the summer heat and humidity were oppressive, and he could not sleep at night. But he returned home safely at the end of the year. And in 1801, his eldest son, who would become the sixth Earl of Carlisle in 1825, married Georgiana Cavendish, the eldest daughter of the famous Georgiana, 5th Duchess of Devonshire, thereby uniting the great Whig houses of Castle Howard and Chatsworth in Derbyshire. Between 1802 and 1823, Georgiana gave birth to 12 children. Thus, for the best part of 2 decades, she was pregnant on average every 18 months. And this may explain her frequent struggles with melancholy. She composed prayers and undertook various exercise and dietary regimes in an attempt to improve her spiritual well-being. And in a portrait by Robert Thorburn much later, she's depicted very much as a Victorian materfamilias, and her domestic correspondence is proof of her energy and commitment to the household. She redecorated the interiors, ordered new carpets, reupholstered much of the furniture. No detail escaped her attention. She warned against the smells of fresh paint. She ordered double glazing for the winter. When the prayer books in the chapel became too tattered, she had them replaced. And she became a tireless compiler of inventories and catalogues. Outdoors, she became irate when trees were felled without her knowledge, and she donated £50 towards the building of a local church on the estate. After the death of her husband in 1848, the running of the estate passed to her eldest son, the bachelor 7th Earl, who, as a government minister, had formed a close personal relationship with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And in the summer of 1850, he invited the royal couple to stay at Castle Howard, en route to their new family home at Balmoral in Scotland. Now, royal visits, even private ones such as this, are guaranteed to cause two things: a frenzy of activity and anxiety on the part of the host, and great expense, as the house is made both comfortable and opulent. Memoranda flew back and forth between Carlisle, who was in London, and the household in Yorkshire. He went shopping for lace curtains, a new carpet, fire grates, inkstands, and he also invested in a new billiard table, which was rapidly transported to Yorkshire. The interiors were smartened up or redecorated. Comfort and elegance were the priority, and the couple were to stay in the High South, a prestigious suite of apartments on the first floor of the house, with a saloon decorated by Pellegrini. And modern plumbing of a sort was installed, with new bathrooms forming rather strange extensions onto the roof. You'll see them at the end of the red arrows, these little squares on the edge of the roof, and then highlighted in the detail, you'll see what looks like a little wooden shed sitting out on high. Now, we might laugh at this today, but they were pretty modern in 1850, even though it was going to be some years before running water, as we know it, was introduced into the castle. But this royal visit to Castle Howard was defined really by the railway. This was the first time that Victoria and Albert had travelled north to Yorkshire and beyond by train. They were, of course, familiar with steam travel. Victoria had made her first journey by train in 1842 from Windsor to London, declaring that she was quite charmed by the experience. And Albert is celebrated for his comment, "Not quite so fast next time, Mr. Conductor, if you please." The royal couple soon had their own carriage, which was fitted out luxuriously, and they became accustomed to journeying by train, to be greeted with pomp and pageantry at stations. And so on the 27th of August 1850, the royal train arrived at York, connected immediately with the York to Scarborough railway line, steamed along the Derwent Valley to the Castle Howard station on the top left of the picture here, which had been built in 1846. And from here, the small entourage travelled 2 miles to Castle Howard in carriages along the famous avenue through the gatehouse before arriving at the north front of Castle Howard. And Carlisle's technological coup was to install special gas lighting in the Great Hall. A ring of burners was mounted round the balcony beneath the dome, with 2,000 separate tubes to create 15 illuminated letters that spelt out "God Save the Queen." And in the evening, local worthies gathered for a reception beneath this patriotic spectacle, and this was followed by a dinner. The following day, the royal couple toured the estate, and Victoria was especially interested in Hawksmoor's mausoleum, since she was contemplating a new vault for the royal family. And in her diary she noted, "It's just the sort of thing I wish one day to build for ourselves," and she even made a sketch of it. Albert inspected prize cattle, there was a ceremonial tree planting, and they witnessed a cricket match. The visit passed off successfully, and the gaslight in particular was a triumph. But Carlisle and his family had to endure the foibles of the monarch. Her notorious wish for windows to be thrown open and fires dampened down, and her customary lateness for receptions. And if Carlisle had one regret, it was, as he noted in his diary, that Victoria has not the way of putting a room quite at its ease. Now, the Earl maintained the family tradition of travel, visiting France and Italy in 1823, and then in 1826 he attended the coronation of Tsar Nicholas I in St. Petersburg. During the 1830s, he spent much of his time in Dublin as a minister. But when he lost his parliamentary seat in the general election of 1841, he decided to embark on a 12-month sabbatical tour of North America. During this time, he kept a detailed journal, which he interleaved with engravings of American scenery by W.H. Bartlett. It took 16 days to cross the Atlantic before reaching landfall at Halifax in Nova Scotia. And as he disembarked, he reflected on his arrival in a different part of the globe. You can see underlined on the bottom of the screen, "I leave the ways of the deep and tread the soil of the new world." This was a wondrous experience for him. And he then travelled down the eastern seaboard to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, meeting with authors, clergymen, public figures, and politicians. Traveling through North America, he was amazed at the abundance of food served at mealtimes, and he set down a specimen dinner. Macaroni soup, roast lamb, boiled chicken, patties, rissoles, potatoes, beetroot, apples and squash, which I tasted and liked. The one tablecloth is taken off and a second course comes on. Apple pie, raspberry pudding, ice cream, preserved ginger, preserved pears. Then the dessert comes, apples, pears and grapes. And the Earl was also astonished by the beauty and grandeur of the American landscape, and he continually described the sunsets in his journal. But his favourite sight was the Niagara Falls, which he visited 3 times, noting, "I felt them to be complete and that nothing could go beyond them." And as a man of strong religious faith, he described Niagara as God's sublimest temple. And then after leaving Washington, he paid a visit to George Washington's tomb at Mount Vernon before moving south to Charleston, and then he sailed to Cuba. Now, the Earl was vehemently opposed to slavery, frequently debating the matter with plantation owners and slave traders. During his visit to Cuba and the southern states, he witnessed slaves at work on plantations, scenes that he found shocking. And in Charleston, he was revolted to encounter an auction of 200 slaves, noting that it almost made my blood boil. And in 1852, along with his sister Harriet, Duchess of Sutherland, the Earl hosted campaigners like Harriet Beecher Stowe on their fundraising tours in England. And Stowe asked him to write the preface to the English edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Earl admired the book greatly, which was a publishing phenomenon on both sides of the Atlantic, quite probably the most significant anti-slavery work ever written, and in the second half of the 19th century, it was only outsold by the Bible. And then the Earl completed his tour with a voyage up the Mississippi from New Orleans all the way up to Detroit, followed by a canoeing and camping expedition across the Great Lakes, during which he nearly drowned. Wading into the water, he lost his footing, and unable to swim, he was floundering out of his depth until a companion dived in and rescued him. Now, the 7th Earl was born in the era of horse-drawn transport and sail-powered shipping. But when he died in 1864, he'd crossed the Atlantic on steamships, sent and received rapid communications by telegraph, and travelled Britain by locomotive, as well as owning £50,000 worth of railway shares. He was amazed at how journey times shrank as speeds became greater. In the early 1840s, the journey between Castlehound and London by rail took 10 hours. By 1855, it had been cut to 6, and journeys began increasingly to be measured in time rather than distance in the new railway timetables. Now, towards the end of the 19th century, it was his nephew George Howard who became the 9th Earl of Carlisle. In 1863, as a young man, he'd met Rosalind Stanley, who was well-educated, widely read, and familiar with the cut and thrust of political debate coming from a political family. And a year later, the couple married, and sharing a love of art, literature, and music, they immersed themselves in London society. And Rosalind's early letters to George are a touching record of a passionate love affair between 2 high-minded, idealistic young people. And his replies to her also contained similar utterances. But he felt more able to express himself through his drawing and painting, and from time to time enclosed little intimate sketches of Rosalind in bed or undressed, and these illustrated the depths of his feelings. In their day, these little drawings were somewhat risque, and Rosalind referred to them as naughty, but she did not destroy them when she ordered her papers later in life. And this little pen sketch here, he ponders on probabilities at the top and possibilities at the bottom. And the couple visited Italy repeatedly, their travels principally motivated by the Earl's passion for painting. And while English and Italian scenery were his first love, he gradually voyaged further to Egypt, India, South Africa, and the West Indies, producing oils and watercolours. And at other times, his family would feature in his sketches, And among his most entertaining images are a series of ink drawings recording episodes from family holidays. So on the left, we have the mishaps of travel, railway chaos on a platform in Paris. At the bottom, you can see the porter unaware of the violin case on the platform, and the little comment below is the fiddle in danger. And then on the right-hand side, it's a picture of mother falling into a rock pool in Cornwall. These are delightful little sketches in an album of his. And then on one trip, he made a playful bird's eye view of Italy, entitled A View of Italy Showing the Principal Objects of Interest and of Value in That Country. And this sketch marked in the towns the family had visited, but on closer inspection, it reveals that the objects of interest and value were not things they acquired or had seen, but items they had lost or left behind. Binoculars, a guidebook, a cat, a cap, and in Genoa he even drew a child, referring to when his young son Kit had become separated from the family. And the charm of this view is how it turns the concept of the Grand Tour on its head. Castle Howard may be a house filled with treasures from Italy, collected by generations of Howards, but during one brief episode, Howard items were left scattered throughout Italy. Well, the first half of the 20th century was marked by horror and disaster. From 1914 onwards, it was impossible for anyone to escape the slaughterhouse of the Great War. Geoffrey Howard, who had inherited Castle Howard after the death of his father in 1911, served in Belgium, where he witnessed the bombardment of Ypres. But in 1915, he returned to his political career in London as part of the inner circle of Prime Minister Herbert Asquith's Liberal government. But like many families, the Howards paid a heavy price during the war. In 1916, the 9th Countess's young secretary, James Mitchell, was killed. He's in the top left picture, the young figure on the right-hand side there. He's wearing glasses, if you look closely at that picture. Among the effects that were returned to Castle Howard, because he was effectively an orphan, were 6 pairs of glasses after his death, a really touching little kind of memento. And then a year later, in 1917, the Countess's own son Michael was reported missing at the Battle of Passchendaele and later confirmed as dead. Well, after the war, Geoffrey and his wife raised their 5 children: Christian, Mark, George, Christopher and Catherine at Castle Howard. But the couple died in the 1930s before their children came of age. And so the family trustees suggested that the family might like to dispose of Castle Howard. The common feeling at this time was that such grand houses were white elephants, too expensive to staff and to maintain. And Mark, who's on the extreme left of this group picture, the eldest son, he seemed receptive to this idea, but all such deliberations came to a halt with the outbreak of war in September 1939. And what followed were the darkest days for the estate. In November 1940, whilst the house was occupied by a girls' school, fire ravaged through the building, destroying 20 rooms as well as the great crowning dome. The 3 sons were away on service. Mark was to die in Normandy in 1944, and in the same year the youngest son Christopher died whilst flying with the RAF. The middle son, George, was far away in Burma, where he was wounded in action. So by the end of the war, George Howard found himself the inheritor of Castle Howard. And on his return from the Far East, he was met with a severely damaged building, nearly a third of it open to the skies, the grounds overgrown, the woods felled, and the splendid array of 18th century monuments in danger of decay and collapse. At the end of the decade, he made the momentous decision to keep Castle Howard as a family home. Many owners, after all, would have walked away from this daunting prospect. The school vacated the building, and after his marriage in 1949 to Lady Cecilia Fitzroy, the couple moved into the house where they brought up their 4 sons. And then in 1952, he was among a handful of stately home owners who opened their doors to the public, thereby kick-starting a huge heritage industry that is still so important in the UK today. And he was a passionate advocate for Castle Howard, personally leading tours of the house, as you can see on the bottom right, arranging the displays in the rooms, and even selling the guidebooks at the entrance. He was also determined to set about restoring the house and the estate, repairing buildings in danger of collapse, such as in the top left, the temple, or the bottom right, the mausoleum, as well as in the central picture, rebuilding that dome which had been lost. And once that had been built, decorating the underside in 1961 to 62. And in the past 60 years, the estate has spent more than £40 million on restoration projects. So not only did George Howard revive Castle Howard's fortunes, but also its popularity with the public, opening a costume gallery, hosting events, radio and television shows, as well as boosting its worldwide reputation by offering the house as a location for the world-famous filming of Brideshead Revisited, first broadcast in 1981. In later years, he divided his time between running Castle Howard and public life, occupying a number of chairmanships with various heritage and tourism bodies. And in 1982, he was appointed chairman of the governors of the BBC. A year later, he was made a life peer, taking the title of Lord Howard of Henderscove. Following his death in 1984, Castle Howard was run first by his son Simon, who stepped down in 2015 when his brother Nicholas and his wife Victoria took over the estate. And here they are today with their dog Poppy on the south front of the house. So this is a story that runs forwards in time and backwards too, reviewing centuries of history and heritage. And in 1982, at a ceremony to bury the BBC time capsule at Castle Howard, George Howard explained his perspective on history and of the need to look backwards as well as forwards. The capsule is not due to be opened until 3982. All that I do and believe, he wrote, is rooted in continuity, but to have a sense of history need not inhibit evolution. And these words are an exact summation of Castle Howard, a house that is always in a state of becoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, so much for that fantastic presentation. Before we get to your questions, we have some upcoming programs that I would like to mention. On December 17th, I will be giving, I will be actually the guest in an American Inspiration series about my new book, A British Country House, Alphabet, Historical and Pictorial Journey. And then on December 20th, I'll be giving a lecture on medieval architecture in England called Origins and Echoes, Medieval British Architecture from the 11th to the 20th Century. And then we have an exciting new tour that we've just announced that will take place between May 14th and May 19th in Santa Fe to coincide with the Santa Fe International Literary Festival. Now, let's get to your tours. We want you to come on our tours. Let's get to your questions. And actually have a number of very exciting questions piling up here, Chris. I'm going to start with, have you ever considered a book entitled The Adventures of Rover?
I don't think there's enough in there to make a book. On the other hand, I mean, a talented children's author.
I was going to say it could be a children's book. Yes, absolutely.
I mean, a talented children's author. When we have children's little kind of I Spy sheets when they come around Castle Howard, Rover is one of the things we try to make them kind of spot because it's such a good story. So yeah, there's a children's book definitely to be written there, even all the way up to Rover's sad demise in Paris.
Oh yes. Does the Castle Howard railway station still exist?
The railway station still exists beside the railway line. The railway line still functions, but the railway station is no longer a railway station, and it was sold from the estate way back in the 60s, and is now a private dwelling, and the York to Scarborough trains go past in either direction every hour. Now, we've often thought about, wouldn't it be great to have, say, a very exclusive group of many of your American colleagues come to England, take a train to York, get on a special train to the Castlehoward train station, and then drive by carriage up the avenue to Castlehoward, just like Victoria and Albert did. Unfortunately, it's almost impossible to ask the railway companies to do anything like that. The nearest you could have would be a steam train that would go past the station. Alas, it would not stop there.
I love the fact that you've even considered that. Can you tell us what happened to the title Earl of Carlisle, which does not seem to be associated with Castle Howard any longer?
Yeah, well, the ninth Earl and Countess of Carlisle, they died in 1911 and 1921, respectively. And they really decided they wanted to divide their estates equally amongst their children. So they broke with that custom of eldest son getting everything, which had been the practice in the family up until that point. Now, the eldest son obviously took the title because that was not something that they could dispose of in any other direction. But of the various family homes, he decided to take Naworth Castle in Cumbria as his house. So he moved to there. And from there, obviously, another cadet line starts to develop the new Earls of Carlisle. Whereas Castle Howard was offered to the ninth Earl and Countess's daughter, but she actually declined it and said her younger brother Geoffrey should have Castle Howard. So he became the owner of Castle Howard. He is a Howard, but he was simply the Honourable Geoffrey Howard. And so the title Earl of Carlisle, it still exists, but it doesn't exist at Castle Howard. I hope that's clear amongst all the complexities of English inheritance law.
Can you tell us how large the Castle Howard estate is today?
The estate today is 9,000 acres, and that roughly divides into three of roughly farmland, forestry, and parkland. And the estate has actually been 140 years ago, the estate was 13,000 acres. So it shrunk a bit, but many estates in England in the 20th century have been dramatically downsized. Castle Howard still has 9,000 contiguous acres, with the house more or less sitting in the center of the estate.
This is a very interesting question. What is the name of the delightfully legible style of the third Earl's handwriting in the later 1600s?
Wow, I've never been asked that question before. It's I don't know that it has a style. It's not really italic style as you would understand it in the early 17th century. It's kind of the beginnings of kind of more freestyle as we would know it today. Obviously, there are some little quirks so that these become ye's, and sometimes you have bigger kind of loops on letters and things like that. But I think the other point behind this, even though I can't technically answer it, is that with only one exception, the handwriting of all these generations of the family is remarkably clean and legible. So for someone like me wanting to research these documents, it really is a godsend. The one person whose handwriting is abominable is the Duchess of Sutherland, she who was the sister of the seventh Earl, she who was an anti-slave campaigner in England. I have tried for weeks to read her handwriting, impossible. But the rest of the family, great. And then, of course, at the end of the 19th century, you have this wonderful invention that appears in all the documentation. I mean, I should say, Curt, that we have an intact archive here, 300 years of documentation. That's why I can tell you these stories. This is a family that never threw anything away. But of course, at the end of the 19th century, memoranda and letters and things start to be typed. So the typewriter arrives. And so that makes reading both quicker and easier.
Can you tell us where the money came from? This is always a question we get about these big houses.
Well, if I had a dollar for every time I'd been asked that question, I would be very, very right. In the mists of time, land is the source of wealth. If you look at their acreage across the whole of the north of England, this branch of the family, it was 78,000 acres in the 1870s. You go back to the Dukes of Norfolk in the 16th century, they probably had land holdings more than the king. They were the richest magnates in the land, with lands in practically every county. But generally, land is the source of wealth from rent rolls and farming and things like that. And of course, in England, the historical story goes that with agricultural depression at the end of the 19th century, that money doesn't go so far. And that's why rents contract, why houses are sold, collections are broken up. And today, the money comes from our business, quite simply. I mean, we are a business of businesses. So the visitor attraction is a major part of our annual turnover. But then so is farming, so is forestry, so is property and other ventures. And of course, all estates, if they're going to survive, have to diversify. For us, unlike some of the very wealthy estates, there's never been an urban portfolio. There haven't been acres of York, there haven't been a couple of acres of London, or even better, half an acre of Manhattan. So, as this estate has tended to have to survive in the 20th century off agriculture and tourism.
Can you tell us why one wing of the house looks different than the other?
Well, the house took a long time to build. The first burst of building with Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor and the third Earl starts in 1699. The house is three-quarters finished by 1715, by which I mean the east wing, the central block, and of course the great dome. And at that point, the west wing, which was envisaged as being identical to the east wing, work stopped on that because Carlisle and his architects had become completely absorbed in designing the landscape, filling it with an obelisk, a temple, a mausoleum, a pyramid. And that's what you have to understand about Carlisle. It's not just this magnificent house, it's this magnificent house in a magnificent designed landscape. So consequently, when the third Earl's son in the 1750s got round to building the West Wing, completing the house, he asked his son-in-law, Sir Thomas Robinson, an amateur architect, to design this. And architectural fashions had changed. So the Baroque of the early part of the century had gone out of fashion. Palladianism, this new kind of neoclassical style, was the fashion. So young Sir Thomas Robinson builds the West Wing to a completely different style in a Palladian style. So there's a suggestion that he might have actually then decided, well, do you know what? I'll go on and rebuild the rest of Castlereagh in my style. But that never happened. So you have that hybrid, those two mismatching wings, which for some people, they find that odd and offensive. In the 18th century, they certainly did. Today, we just see it as part of that kind of evolutionary hybrid that is the house.
Indeed. And staying with the house, how did this fire in 1940 start, and was the house bombed during the war?
The house was never bombed during the war. We were mercifully too far away from serious air attack, although it should be said that York, 15 miles away, did have some air raids early in the war, what was known as the Baedeker raids, those kind of cultural air raids, but that was a very brief moment. No, the fire was an accidental fire, and there are conflicting reports. Generally, it's thought to be a chimney fire, but it might have been an electrical fault as well. So that's how it starts. I mean, the problem then was that there were delays in reporting it. It was sort of spotted at about 4 or 5 a.m. Weirdly, somebody said, "I'm going to ring the station," but they rang the police station and not the fire station. So more minutes passed, more delay. The wind got up. This is always one of the terrible things with fires in country houses. If it's a windy day and the wind's blowing in the wrong direction, then you've got problems, as we had. So the wind was blowing from the east, so it blew it through the house in a westerly direction. And that's why the destruction was so extensive.
Have there been any archaeological digs in the estate? And if so, have there been any interesting finds?
Well, the area is full of Roman remains and things like that. We've not done any digs on the estate. Now, we used to have in the UK a very popular TV program on archaeology called Time Team. And there would be a group who would parachute into a site anywhere in the country and dig in a fairly kind of surgical, precise way and come up with findings. It was, a short little kind of project and televised. And they came to Castlereagh more than 20 years ago. And they tried to find traces of that medieval village that had been swept away when Castlereagh was built. They found very little, really. And one of the reasons they found so little is they felt that, the house is surrounded by gardens and dressed lawns and flower beds and things, so that this terrain had been worked over and worked over through the centuries. So every time a new flower bed was built or a slight modification to the garden here, clearly a little bit more evidence was lost. Now, they were only doing keyhole little digs here and there. If we'd said to them, you can dig the whole site up, which we would never have done, of course, then I dare say they would have found more evidence.
Sticking with that, meaning the house, has all of the fire damage that occurred during the war been repaired?
No, it hasn't. 20 rooms and the dome destroyed that morning. The dome, as you know, was rebuilt. We have fully restored 4 rooms, and in 5 months' time, I'm going to really jubilantly say we will have restored a 5th room. It takes an enormous time. I mean, the dome and the roof were, hugely expensive projects. Then you could consider some of the interiors. So there is still a burnt out wing. And that section in the high south where Victoria and Albert stayed, that is still a shell. Now, we are determined to kind of restore and repair those, but, we only as and when we can afford to do so.
So you've talked about the last 300 years. I know this is an impossible question, but what do you see for the next 300 years of Castle Howard?
Okay, so everyone's got their forward planners out. Okay, right, we're ready for 23, 24. Well, the trite answer would be more of the same. No, family continuity, and of course, barring global calamity or whatever, we will continue to operate as a visitor attraction. We will continue to operate as an estate. We will do the business that we know well. And the family will, that commitment with the family is, unquestionable, even with the current and the future generations. And there will be people who will still work here. I mean, we employ 100 people full time to do all the many things that run the estate. It will just continue. Whether there are kind of new little initiatives here or there, I can't crystal ball gaze as much as that. But I think the determination is, and it's a mantra amongst all families who own houses and estates, that with each generation, their responsibility is to pass it on to the next generation in at least as good, if not better condition than when it was passed to them.
So this is an interesting question. Someone says, is there any idea why the dome was the last big restoration project? I would say, based on what I know, that that was most assuredly not the last big restoration project. And from what you've told me over the years, restoration projects are happening every year, sometimes many projects within 1 year. Could you elaborate a little bit more about restoration at Castle Howard? And when I say that, I'm really not thinking of the house. I'm thinking about the hundreds, and I should emphasize hundreds of buildings on the estate that are listed, all of which need care and attention.
Yeah, I mean, restoration is a never-ending game. It's ongoing everywhere on all kinds of scales. So yes, there's been a lot of work on the house, the mausoleum, the temple, the pyramid, those really key structures outside. Those have been restored, actually, some of them quite recently. We're restoring the landscape too. I mean, great chunks of the famous tree-lined avenue had to be felled and replanted. We have something like 1 in 5 listed properties in this council jurisdiction sit on the Castle Howard estate. So we have an obligation to look after them. And work is going on those. Now, they might be reactive repairs because there's been a terrible wind and there's been damage, or they may be part of a strategic program of repairs that we attend to as and when, we can in times of the year and funds permitting and so on. And also restoration extends all the way into site improvement. So it's not just the glamorous heritage restoration. You have to think about the public facilities that we have to here, and in the cafeterias, the toilets, the car parks, all of those, really consume money. I mean, these places are the proverbial money pit. And then don't forget the collection. So the program of cleaning paintings, of restoring furniture, and things like that. So that's really the lifeblood of Castle Howard. But it is, strenuous, very costly, but there is the determination to do everything that we can at any given moment.
Can you tell us the best time of year to visit Castle Howard and how many visitors do you receive annually?
So we receive in excess of 250,000. Last year was 270,000. We are open 7 days a week from the beginning of April, pretty much until the end of August. So this season we end on this Sunday, but that is not the end of our house opening. We have 2 weeks where we dress the house for Christmas, and then we have a traditional 6 or 7 week Christmas opening period. Again, 7 days a week. So if you want to see Castle Howard as Castle Howard, don't come when it's Christmas because the house is festooned with Christmas. And this year's themed Christmas is Alice in Wonderland. It will be spectacular and marvelous. And let's face it, families adore it. Last year was Peter Pan, for example. But if you want to see Castle Howard as Castle Howard and enjoy the landscape too, then clearly spring, I would say April, May. I think September's a lovely month too. If you can stay a bit later into October, then you get our autumn colors. Now, I know, America has stunning autumn colors, but what we do have here too.
So I want to say I have been to Castle Howard many times in many different seasons, and for me, October is the most beautiful time. I'm very biased because I prefer the autumn, but I also think the temperature is perfect. There's a softness to the light. I think it's just
Absolutely.
lovely. Um, so I don't know the answer to this question, and I'm embarrassed that I don't. Was Castle Howard featured in Barry Lyndon?
It was, yes, it's there. I mean, we've got quite a long kind of pedigree of being in movies, and Kubrick's Barry Lyndon was one of them. I mean, it's not as prominent as say Castle Howard was in Brideshead, but yeah, parts of it was shot here. So the great Stanley Kubrick was spotted in this corner of Yorkshire. An earlier film had Sophia Loren in it, Lady L, and David Niven, and Peter Ustinov. And can you imagine how the locals felt seeing these kind of movie stars strolling around the village lanes here way back in the 60s? So yeah, there's a long tradition of filming at Castle Howard.
Could you say that there's one person, in your opinion, who was the most important in the influence of the creation, the design, and just sort of the collection of the house?
Ooh, Curt, that's tricky. I mean,
I
obviously,
know I resisted asking this question because I would say it's the third Earl. He created the house, but I think there are lots of subtleties here.
in that sense, I mean, yeah, no third Earl, no Castle Howard. So that's a simple answer. You see, what we say is that three men were responsible for Castle Howard. It was the third Earl and his two architects, Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor, and there was undoubtedly a close relationship and a congenial relationship between them. I mean, the Earl was godfather to Vanbrugh's children. I mean, Hawksmoor was perhaps a little more deferential to the Earl, but the really important thing is that patron and architects clicked in some ways, and we know that history is full of kind of building projects that go pear-shaped because of
Hmm.
quarreling personalities or whatever. So you have to say they are the first answer. But then you would have to look at other key people who, for example, the fourth and the fifth Earls building up those enormous collections of paintings and sculpture and things like that. Really important. But then, as you've heard me say before, please don't forget the women who are extremely important here. And then if you run it up to date, you have to say that George Howard after the war was central. I mean, you could almost say no George Howard, no Castle Howard today. He could have walked away from it, but he didn't.
And it would have been torn down, which we know the trustees were recommending that, if I believe.
Well, it would have been torn down, sold, left to decay, moulder away. There were, on average, one country house a week was coming down in the 50s and the 60s and the early 70s. And so, Castlereagh could very easily have joined that sad roll call. And I think it's where you get to this really exciting point when you start to look at, you look at a building, you look at collections, and you do this, you very well, Curt, and you can talk about them, but sooner or later you have to inject what I call the flesh and blood element into it. Who was the personality? Who was the commitment? Who was the driving force? Equally, there are moments when who didn't care, and you can sometimes find that in other houses. Here, you've got this long, passionate centuries of engagement and devotion, really.
So I've saved, I think, one of the best questions for last. What was the pathway 4 decades ago toward your becoming curator of Castle Howard when you were a young man?
Uh, Yeah, I was young once. Yeah.
Weren't
Um,
we all?
it's really it's happenstance. I was a student in York, so I mean I was living in this part of the world, and um, I visited Castle Howard as a punter one day, and I was interested in those days. I was really interested in books because I was doing a PhD and all sorts of things like that. And the books on in the rooms and display were rather badly ordered. Nobody could tell me about them. So I wrote to the family and said, I enjoyed my visit. You'd got really interesting looking library. It didn't seem terribly organized. I don't suppose you want somebody to come and sort it out, do you? Never
Uh,
expected a reply. And then one day I went to my little pigeonhole in my college at the university, and there was a letter in, markedly superior stationery addressed to me. And that was George Howard saying, well, come and talk to us. And
I'll
so
be
that's
damned.
how I began in 1983.
Gosh, from George Howard himself. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Chris. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have today
Sure.
for questions. If you have other questions, you can always email us at heritagetours@nehgs.org. And if they are pertaining to Chris, we will be happy to forward them on for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you soon on our future online programs. Goodbye for now.